Hi everyone, welcome to this BRIC Town Hall. We're doing this in collaboration with the folks at Housing Works this evening, and we've all gathered here tonight for Pride 2020, LGBTQ civil rights. This is something that's been in the works for a few months now. We're happy to have our community partners sitting on the stage and sitting out in the audience, and it's a very important topic, only made more and more in the front of everyone's minds by the events of this weekend. And before we get started with the town hall, we're actually going to begin with a welcome from a New York City Council member who happens to be from Brooklyn, representing the 38th District, Brooklyn's first openly LGBT City Council member, Mr. Carlos Menchaca.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. And buenas noches, everyone. I know we are live, and I just wanted to open with some remarks. We are all assembling right now at 7:30 at Grand Army Plaza as Brooklyn residents to have a vigil tonight. But before I go, I wanted just to say thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this conversation. My name is Carlos Menchaca, and I am 35 years old. I am Mexican, and I am gay. I'm also a legislator, the first openly gay legislator in Brooklyn, the first Mexican-American elected in the city council. Now, don't let this suit and tie and the role deceive you. I am not different from you. And when we all were getting ready for the Puerto Rican Day Parade this Sunday, we all were hit and shocked with that hate-filled atrocity. And in that moment, I remember feeling like, and especially when we found out how young all of these were, these young people were, we all felt like we were them. And so in that light, and in this preparation for 2 months that you've been putting this together, let's continue to think about how we change that energy of anger and sorrow and sadness and do some good with it. And that's what we're trying to do as we come together as a community and unite. And it's not just the LGBT community. We're talking about the Latino community. We're talking about people of color, our Muslim community. Everyone needs to unite. And finally, I have a call to action. Today, we just passed the city council budget, over $70 billion of work that we did to finally pass it, and that just happened today. It was a good moment for the immigrant community. It was a good moment for the LGBT community. But the only way that we get there is by having people represent us at the tables of power. And so the only way we change laws, and the laws that we're thinking about right now are our gun laws. And the only way we do that is by having people at the table. And so the way we change laws is we change to lawmakers. The way we make budget decisions is we put people in those rooms to make those budget decisions. And we can't do that together. We're joined here by Ritchie Torres, my brother from the Bronx, the only openly gay legislator, and he's going to get an introduction later from the Bronx. And we're alone in our boroughs. We need you out there. We need women, we need transgender, gender nonconforming people in this house, the city council, legislative house. We need you. And so that's what I'm asking all young people to think about. As you hear the conversation today, I want you to place yourself, if you're not there already, in a moment of, or in a move for power and fierceness, because we need to move this agenda forward. And so I thank all the panelists, and we're off. I'm off with the public advocate, Tish James, to join her and all the Brooklynites as we have our vigil here in Brooklyn tonight. So thank you, as I started, and I welcome you to the table. Thank you.
So as Councilmember Menchaca just mentioned, there is an event that's happening not far from here, not long away from now, but we're happy that you decided to be here. We know that there's lots of ways to grieve and have your voice be heard, and we're happy that you chose to choose this venue to come and share your thoughts. To that end, we definitely do want to hear those thoughts. We encourage you to text and tweet and use the hashtag #BeHeard. We'll be monitoring those all evening and as the weeks go on, and we'll also have an open question and answer period where you can address our panelists and share a dialogue, and just if you need to, vent a little. But before we get into that, I'm going to introduce you to the folks who we're going to be having the conversation with. So right here to my left, I'm happy to introduce you to Meredith Talusan. She's a Filipino transgender writer, editor, and advocate, and also the LGBT staff writer at Buzzfeed as your day job.
Right.
And the power behind the website, Self-Made Woman. Thank you for being here this evening, Meredith.
Thank you.
And Ritchie Torres, as Carlos stole my thunder a little bit, as you've always been introduced, is the youngest member of New York City Council and is also the only openly gay legislator from the
first,
Bronx.
not the only.
The first.
Not the only.
The first.
I had a colleague who just came out. So.
Good deal. Good for him.
Amazing.
Yeah, that worked out.
I used to work for him. So.
Okay. Rewrite, he is the first openly gay elected from the Bronx in the city council. Thank you for being here, Councilmember Torres. And next to the council member is Kiara St. James. She is a non-discrimination activist, an advocate who works with the people at Housing Works who, if you don't know, you should know that they are hoping to end the dual crisis of homelessness and AIDS through their relentless advocacy. So thanks for being here,
Thank
Kiara
you.
and Sharon. And next to Kiara, yeah, you can have full claps. We don't need to stop. We're worthy. And next to Kiara is Carl Siciliano, who's been recognized by the White House as one of the champions of change. But in 2002, he was the founder and still is the executive director over at the Forney Center, the nation's largest and most comprehensive housing program for LGBT youth. Thank you for being here this evening. And finally, we have Professor Katherine Franke, who is coming to us from Columbia Uptown, is the professor of law at the Columbia School of Law, where she's also the director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, and she's among the nation's leading scholars on writing about the law and religion, rights, and drawing from feminist, queer, and critical race theory. So these are our panelists for the evening. Thank you for being here. So you may have also noticed in the materials that we were expecting a very special guest who happened to have been grounded by thunderstorms in Atlanta, but he is with us in spirit. So Kenyon Farrow was meant to be here. He's maybe flying here now safely, we hope, but he had every intention of being here. You should still check out the website and get to know the people at at Treatment Action, the Treatment Action Group. They do great work surrounding HIV and AIDS and really eradicating the thing and working on all the social constructs that keep it going. But thank you to our panelists and Kenyon, who's in the air somewhere. But to begin, as Councilmember Menchaca mentioned, there has been an event that's at the front of our minds. There's been, in our community, so much sort of casual ease about the way people are mistreated and handled every day who happen to be part of the LGBTQ community, but this incident has sort of crystallized and focused the nation. So I'm going to start with you, Meredith, and ask where the momentum is after this. How do we make sure that this tragedy isn't turned into opportunity for those who would seek not to help the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that I was really thinking about while I was, while I was on the train, and just sort of like thinking about the fact that, that the people and the families and, and the victims in Orlando, I think would have wanted, like knowing that they were queer people of color, for us to be able to sort of use this moment to really galvanize as a community. And one of the things for me that has been, like a big kind of like point of conflict, especially for me and other trans women of color friends, is sort of like thinking through the way in which our community, our segment of the community, has been racked with violence, so consistently over the past few years, and and sort of like trying to sort of reconcile that with, with the communities that have been affected by the incident in Orlando. I do think that, that it feels too soon to talk about, it as an opportunity, to me, at least, but at the same time, I also know that, it's something that a lot of people in that community would have wanted, and I really hope that we can use this moment to galvanize as a community, first of all, to be able to sort of talk more openly about, about the ways in which we can collaborate, and as well as the fissures that have historically been, we've experienced, and in that moment, then be able to unify against the forces that are oppressing us.
So on the same theme of unifying behind the tragedy.
Look, out of tragedy can come solidarity and a heightened awareness of our shared humanity. And it is an act of terror. It was an act of hate. The point of terror is to strip us of our freedom and our dignity through fear. And I think the message from the LGBT community should be, we refuse to be terrorized. Right? We refuse to live in fear, and we insist on being free. Free from discrimination, free from violence, free from the hatred that inspires all of it. And so that's the message we should send.
Kiara, what were your thoughts moving forward since Sunday morning?
Yeah, so as was stated earlier, we definitely are dealing with forces out there that want to erase, our existence here, and our right to exist. And so one of the main things we have to do is heal as a community and start that process, but also understand that, as I said, there's forces bigger than, there are forces out there that want to destroy us. So we need to make sure that we're doing our part to work closer together and put aside egos and be more about community and making sure that we're hearing from our community, we're making sure that our community is safe, and then move forward from there.
Carl, you want to get him?
When I think about this devastating moment, all of these dead, queer, young people of color, it reminds me in a way of where I was at when I started the Ali Forney Center, because I and my coworkers had gone through the experience of having a number of homeless queer youth murdered on the streets of New York. Ali Forney was a gender nonconforming youth who was murdered in 1997. Two of Ali's very close friends, Kiki Freeman and Dionne Webster, were two young transgender women who had been murdered in the year before. And sometimes you have to really hit bottom before you can build yourself up, And for me personally, I felt like the murders of these young people that I worked with so closely was just such a devastating thing. But in the ensuing years, to have seen the Ali Forney Center emerge and to have so many people in the LGBT community come together to support homeless LGBT youth in a way that didn't happen before, I feel like tragedy and pain and suffering, if we can find ways to transform it. And I'm so sick of hearing religious leaders condemn us and put hate out against us. I'm so sick of political leaders accommodating that and making it seem like it's okay for us to be discriminated against and hated. And I'm just hoping that out of this horrible moment, we can emerge as a stronger community and really push back against the root causes of our oppression.
Professor Franks, this is a teachable moment.
Franke.
Franke.
That's okay. I've been feeling since Sunday morning what feels like a stone in my stomach. I felt heavy. I felt kind of nausea. I felt dis-ease, and I've been trying to figure out what it is. And I think I feel the sadness, the rage that I think so many people are feeling. But I'm also realizing that these events are recalling the kinds of violence I've experienced as a butch lesbian since the 1970s, of cops that beat me up in Riverside Park when I was in college, of going to the Duchess and Paula's and other bars in the 70s and 80s in the Village, and having thugs waiting outside to beat us up. Fortunately, we weren't killed. But so many people in our community, for so many of us, being lesbian or gay or bisexual or trans or gender nonconforming means living in fear. And it means not being sure that the places that you think are safe are actually safe. And sometimes it's our families, and sometimes it's the places where we go to be safe. And thankfully, the Ali Forney Center is one of those places where younger people can and are safe. But what I would ask us to do in response to my stone, and I think maybe others have it as well, is to be careful in our language. To be careful. I resist using the word terror and terrorism.
Why is that?
This is a political term that took on a particular meaning after September 11th. And I think it is necessarily infused with Islamophobia in this country. And what it does, I think, is isolates bad actors, like this individual, like particular Muslims who we should be afraid of, rather than understanding the ways in which we have weaponized fear, hatred, mental illness, disease of certain kinds in this country. It distracts us from that structure. And I think that's the kind of careful thinking and political work we need to be doing as we respond to this. Not to fall into easy language like terrorism that sort of feels good, but to actually think critically so that we're not collaborating with other forms of bias in this moment of enormous pain.
So not making it about the individual, but the underlying pervasiveness of a society where people are marginalized and seen as capable of being disposed of.
It's about disposable lives, for sure, but it's also about a culture of violence that we tolerate in this country, and our elected officials, not all of them, but many of them, particularly in Washington, collaborate in, produce, create by not enacting gun laws. But also, and I'm just going to put this out here, if you want to use the word terrorism, then let's really use it, and let's take Pat Robertson and put him on the no-fly list. Right? Let's take this church out in California where their pastor said 50's not enough. Right? This is the Lord's work. And when people put money in the collection basket on Sunday, they should be prosecuted for providing material support to a terrorist organization.
So a moment ago, you talked about some of these legislators and elected officials. So let's get at this. It's 2016. We're 5 minutes away from potential President Trump or Clinton, depending on which side of the aisle you come down on. So let's talk about the legislative end of this and the fact that they can present these differing views on exactly what it is that happened. So I'm just going to toss this up and ask if the votes and the support of the LGBTQ community is taken for granted on the Democratic side of the aisle, where someone can come out and sort of use coded dog whistle politics words to say, I'm with you, but I don't want to go so far as to alienate someone who may not have evolved on the issue just yet. And if it's time for LGBTQ folks to use the art of the deal and really hold these people to task if they're our legislators.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, Chase Strangio, who's a lawyer at the ACLU, tweeted this, this tweet a couple of days ago talking about the fact that there have been more than 200 anti-LGBT bills in the past 6 months in various legislatures throughout the country.
It's not just North Carolina.
Yeah, and I do think that, I do think that at a local level, there's a lot that we can do, partially because of the fact that that the structures that we're operating under make it so difficult for us to, honestly say that we might be considering, voting for the other quote unquote viable candidate in this election. Mm-hmm. So for me, I've been trying to sort of find ways to both think through the practicalities of the situation, but also empower myself as an individual within a local community, within imagined communities, not just a community of place, but a community of people, of identities, of affinities all across the country, to find creative ways to sort of battle some of these forces that Katherine has been alluding, has been talking about persuasively.
Well, there's one that we can talk about specifically. Kiara, I know you've been on the front lines of fighting for gender. We've seen 7 times it's hopped one hurdle, but last night we saw our governor out speaking in front of thousands in front of Stonewall, but we haven't seen him speak to the people who can clear it on the other side of the legislature.
Right, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really important to highlight, and I feel that we live in a state that likes to say that it's progressive, but at the same time, you have so many New Yorkers throughout the state of New York who are vulnerable, and often you hear the slogan, we want more visibility, but we need to make sure that we have protections. And what gender will do is create those protections that we need so that as we are visible, we know that we are protected and we have recourse of law. And that's something that is really, we need to make sure that we are having these conversations, whether it be with our community members, in the academic world, like having conversations with the students, of like why they have to play a significant part in getting the word out that gender is going to benefit all New Yorkers, not just trans folks, but trans folks, especially trans women of color, are the most vulnerable, and having gender is going to significantly minimize a lot of the issues that we are facing as a community. So yeah, absolutely. It's not enough to have a governor who has given a directive, but we need to make sure that through some type of legislative process, that it's a law of the land that can't be revoked.
There was an article I'm reminded of that I was reading, Professor Franke, where you had a line that said, gaining new rights in a society that still hates you can trigger a wide range of backlash. So how much of this backlash do you think is coming on the heels of marriage equality, the gains that in terms of civil rights and social issues have happened at breakneck speed, slow enough for the community, but what of that backlash, Ritchie?
Look, we have enemies who seek to do harm to us but are attacking us from a position of panic. I do believe progress and history is on our side, but I think we have to be careful not to prematurely declare mission accomplished. What's lodged in the back of my mind is that press release from ESPA in December of 2015 that said that we have accomplished everything we've set out to do. Absolutely. Mission accomplished. There's no longer a need for a statewide lobby for the LGBT community, and I think that's a deeply dangerous mindset. Yeah. There are persistent inequalities in housing and education and health that disproportionately affect people of color. So the battle is far from over. Marriage equality is only one piece of legal equality, and legal equality is only one piece of social equality.
So legal equality and social equality sit squarely at the intersection of this video that I'm about to show you now. For all of the gains that have been made, well, hey, you set it up, I'll knock it down. For all the gains that have been made by the LGBTQ community, there is still the pervasive violence and ignorance that many in our community have to face on the daily. Recently on our BK Live show, as part of our Be Heard series, we profiled a person in our community who was the victim of said violence that happens all too often, but this time happened to have been caught on tape and shared with the community. I have to warn you that there is some strong language, although it's beeped. It may be triggering for a lot of folks, so I want to make you aware of that, but the language is as ugly as what happened, but there is a triumph after, so I'm going to share this video with you right now.
When I walk on the street, people will say, oh, look at that, that's a man or that's a woman. Oh, they are monsters. Oh, it's not right. Or just go, don't walk in front of me, or don't let me see you. I am so used to being abused, and I did not realize that it's bad and it's not right to doing that to me. I come from Taiwan, and at the age 20, and I decided to leave my family because I cannot survive there. A lot of people tell me the same thing. They say it would be a lot better in New York City, but I'm not really agree. Because hate crime and discrimination, it happens everywhere.
Woman's bag, living in a man's penis.
When I go in the Subway on 125th Street. When I sit down on the chair across to me, there's a woman talking about, I don't want this kind of person sitting in front of me. And then I heard that, and I feel so bad, but I pretending I'm reading because I have a lot of experience. Mostly they just say 1-2 times and they will stop. But in this case, it was crazy.
Y'all sell y'all's people, you garbage, motherfucker. You a transvestite videotaping me, motherfucker. Suck my dick. You ain't about shit. You sitting over here recording me while you doing what? Sucking my dick. Okay. Bye.
She keep attacking me and it described she needed a weapon to attack me. I don't know why that much hate in a person that toward to a transgender person or I don't know.
New York is progressive and we're still dealing with these issues, right? So I couldn't imagine living in middle America and being identifying as trans and trying to navigate any kind of support.
We have people who come in who just need to talk with somebody about it, who've actually been attacked or have been with someone who's attacked. It's a constant problem, unfortunately. It's not being tackled expeditiously.
So far this year, I believe it's been around 10 to 11 trans women of color who have been murdered, and we're just not even halfway through the year and we're seeing so much violence.
So I want to right now just acknowledge Pearl Love, who happens to be sitting in the front row here. So yeah, we applaud ourselves and we pat ourselves on the back for being this great liberal progressive place. But if you happen to be a person who's gender nonconforming or anywhere along the spectrum there, you know the neighborhoods you can hold hands in, and you know the ones where you gotta keep your space. So navigating all of that space here in New York City, how do we feel in 2016?
So yeah, I mean, that video, every time I see it, it just touches me. You know, I had this conversation with Pearl when it first happened. Like, it just reminds me when I first came to New York City in the mid-90s and how this was before we had protections and all that, where that was an everyday occurrence, where a lot of me and my girlfriends and gender nonconforming community members, we did not get on the train unless it was a group of us, because we knew like it wasn't just one person, it would be the entire train. And then sometimes it would be their children they would get to attack us and verbally assault us. So I feel that like it speaks to how deeply entrenched people's transphobia is, number one, and how even the fact that this woman later on went on to say that we shouldn't judge her, even though in spite the video shows that clearly she was the one that was the perpetrator of that. Like, this is something that is ongoing. And like, even having legislation, I just don't know, like, how can we, you know, I know it's important, but I know that's something that even legislation it has to be more about how we teach kids in the school system, that they need to learn to be more accepting, because I hate the word tolerance, but they need to be more accepting of diverse cultures, because it starts with raising our children to respect diversity. And that's the only way we can really start minimizing like what Pearl experienced, you know, and that's really where it's gonna have, a lot of work has to get done. You know, we have DASA, Dignity for All Students Act, but I know that it's really important that we do more work in the school systems of getting them to understand. And unfortunately, this lady has children, so imagine what she's teaching her children.
Well, we know that we can't legislate away stupid, but we also know that we can put our tax money where our intentions are, and that center happens to be at the Trans Collective in the Bronx.
Yes, actually, I saw Sean Coleman. I called him an hour ago, telling me I got $70,000 for the Bronx Trans Collective.
Score.
We were able to establish the Bronx Trans Collaborative. We brought all the trans activists, and apparently there's politics even in the non-for-profit world.
Imagine that.
Even in the world of and personalities, but we were able to form the Bronx Trans Collaborative, and now there's a one-stop shop, a central safe space for the trans community in the Bronx. So.
Phenomenal.
And I believe it's the first of its kind in the city.
Yeah, and speaking of that safe space, this is the work that you've been doing since 2002 for folks who may find themselves waking up to family members like said person and find themselves with nowhere to go.
Yeah, 75% of the young people that come to us say that they were abused or assaulted in their homes. So, you know, we have this image of what anti-LGBT violence is. I don't think we understand enough how much of it happens in the home and what a devastating thing it is when, you know, your parents who brought you into the world and who are the people who are supposed to show you what love is, turn on you. You know, something that I was thinking about when you were speaking earlier, you know, the pushback against our victories. There's a real direct correlation between big LGBT victories and LGBT youth getting thrown out of their homes. In the summer of 2011, after marriage equality passed in New York State, the number of young people coming to us from across the state surged by over 40%. And in this last year, since the you know, the big Supreme Court victory, the number of young people coming to us from all over the country has surged by 20%. And I think what happens is you end up with this kind of toxic thing where even though we win, there are many communities that are very opposed to us, especially like conservative religious communities, and they get very riled up by our victories. And you know, it's like Satan is running rampant in society or something like that. But at the same time, like, young people, teenagers, see all this joy, all this celebration, they see all these headlines and, you know, people kissing in the streets and whatever, and it's like, you know, oh, it's so safe and great to be LGBT.
Right.
And so, you know, the young people come out when the parents are all riled up and hostile and the ministers are condemning, you know, and then they come out into this situation where it's estimated that there are 200,000, and that's a conservative number. It's estimated there are 200,000 homeless LGBT youth in the country, and they make up about 40% of a total homeless youth population of 500,000. Do you know how many beds there are in this whole country for homeless kids? 4,000. So there are 4,000 beds in this country for 500,000 homeless kids. Even most of the shelters are run by like large religious organizations where often LGBT kids face all kinds of hardship and discrimination. So, you know, when I think about just violence directed at our community, there's like the violence of mentally ill people and hostile people, but there's also like an institutional violence, you know, that says that children can be out in the streets without having access to a shelter bed. So the kinds of violence directed at us comes from a lot of different directions.
So looking at that idea of the institutional violence, I know a lot of the work that you've done, and your book, Professor Franke, talks about this marriage victory and sort of re-examines it through a lens of queer theory, radical queer theory to be specific. So a lot of these gains may be running contradictory to all of the things that the people who laid down the foundation for LGBTQ rights were sort of running counter to.
That's exactly right, and I would pay an homage for a moment to Paula Edelbrick, who really was one of the leaders in our community early on, saying that of course we need to repeal laws that won't allow us to marry for those couples who want to, but that's just the beginning of the game. It's not the end of the game. We need to think about our complex families that don't always look like marital families or nuclear families. And we take care of each other, we love each other, we have sex with each other. We think of each other in family in very complicated ways. And marriage is for some people, but not for many of us. And as Paul and I were working on this in the 80s and in the 90s, and then I became an academic, I thought there's something African American people can teach us about this. And I went back to see what it was that African American people went through at the end of the Civil War when they could marry for the first time. Might there be some lessons for us today of what it meant to be a freer and more equal people through marriage, because they enjoyed marriage rights as people for the first time when they stopped being property. Unfortunately, what I saw is that we should be careful what we wish for, and that there will be a violent, if not deadly, backlash. There was against newly freed people who married, and tragically, it is one of these situations where one hates to be right. We're seeing it now as well. And religion was used then to deny African American people full citizenship. It's being used now to deny LGBT people full citizenship. So our communities are necessarily one, because of course many LGBT people are people of color, but we need to see our struggles, our political struggles, as tied together, because those histories are so useful for us in thinking about what a victory means and what the prices of those victories might mean. Shameless plug, the book is called Wedlocked.
Wedlocked, yes.
The Perils of Marriage Equality.
So looking at exactly what you said and the need for coalition building if we are to advance, I can't help but be reminded of Prop 8 in California, where record numbers of African Americans showed up to vote for President Obama, first term Obama, and a lot of people tried to use that as the sort of catalyst for why Prop 8 became what it was, saying that these African American people were so instilled in their church values and so against equality for people, all people, that, you know, it was a double bang. We got the black president, but those same people, those Bible thumpers, denied gay people their rights in California. And I know you are very concerned and do a lot of work surrounding people of color and rights and the LGBTQ community.
Being part of that community, I do care a little about it. Yeah.
Being a part of that community as well.
I guess the one question I would ask is, who gets to set the agenda for the LGBT community? I mean, where do we get this notion that marriage equality is the holy grail of LGBT equality? If you're
well, then answer that? Who does get to set the agenda if there are rich white men writing checks?
LGBT youth who's been evicted from your home
Yeah.
by your own parents, and you have no food, you have to engage in survival sex. Thinking about marriage is a luxury. You lack the bare necessities of life. The trouble is that gay incorporated largely consist of white males who have no insight, I mean, no offense, but who have no insight into communities of color. So I think we have to diversify the leadership of the LGBT community.
So let's get at this notion of community then. If we have this community that's made up of a lot of disparate parts and they have one or two really great things in common, but then everything else sort of falls away, how do we build those bridges and make those connections, particularly in a time where, okay, we have one mission accomplished. Do we take our ball and go home while everyone else is still waiting in line for those basic bare necessities of life? How do you incentivize getting people to stay and go further?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for me, it has always been about listening to the most marginalized segments of our community because it's the only way that all of us, can find ways to, to sort of like build connections with each other and to also and to also see the ways in which we are oppressed as a community. When you said something like, when you said something like, oh, like there are the neighborhoods where you can hold hands or not hold hands. When you're a non-passing trans woman of color, especially a black trans woman in New York, and I have, like many friends who are in that position, you don't have the option to decide whether to hold, hold or not hold somebody's hand.
Right.
Like people
Just
are
by
reading your
personhood.
gender, like pretty much all the time, right? And I feel like, there are ways in which for us, it's important for us to center the concerns of people who are, sort of literally on a pervasive day-to-day basis, feeling the effects of this type of verbal and, and at times physical violence.
So didn't Caitlyn Jenner make all of that right?
Right. Yeah, Caitlyn Jenner. Is that a question?
No, I'm saying, but really, get into this boat with me. If we had Laverne Cox on the cover of Time magazine and we followed the line. I actually have the headline that accompanied that, or
The transgender tipping point.
Thank you.
It's emblazoned in my memory.
See, that's why we invited you. The transgender tipping point. So we go from that tipping point to Call Me Kate.
Right.
Is that progress? Or what sort of progress is it?
I think we have to be very careful when we talk, when we have, and I'm not going to say anything negative about Caitlin or Laverne, but I feel it's really important to understand, like, there's a lot of trans folks in the community who have been boots on the ground for many, many years, and they have not been acknowledged. And what happens a lot of times is if you fall into a category where people feel that you're problematic, you're not invited into these spaces, or if you don't look the part of what they feel like that is commercial, where people can relate to you. Because there's a lot of trans folks who are not able to have the surgeries to affirm themselves the way that Caitlin and Laverne have, So we have to be really careful and not be misled by someone's aesthetics, and understand that at the end of the day, for every, especially Black trans woman you see out there, more than half of us are still struggling. We're unemployed. We're dealing with, 1 out of 2 Black trans women is HIV positive. So, at the same time, I think it's great that people are celebrating us, but they're not investing in especially Black trans women. And that's where a lot of the work has to get done, is in investing. We have to make sure that we're not just having like the health factor there. We need to make sure that we have private sector. We need to make sure we have the academic world involved in investing in especially Black trans lives, because that's the only way we're going to minimize a lot of these social factors that trans women are now facing throughout the United States.
So the folks at Make the Road have been a partner with us at BRIC for a lot of events, and they've come here as guests before. And I'm reminded of a study they did where they sent folks out with identical resumes, and the people who were gender nonconforming or trans invariably did not get the call back. So it's essentially they're being forced into all kinds of things, including sex work, because they simply can't get hired at a retail outlet or any number of places along the sort of job strata. But I wanted to go to you with this and talk about some young people who were here before, and they were talking about supportive housing. And just casually, a young woman said to me, "Oh, but if you're trans, you get everything now." So I wondered if there was any sort of sense.
That is so ridiculous.
What is that person smoking?
Okay.
No, well, what I'll tell you, she was here, and they were a youth theater ensemble, and they were sharing the experiences that they had in dealing with the system and seeking supportive housing with the state and municipal organizations and on that level, and meeting with caseworkers. And it really was, it was just a casual throwaway statement. It wasn't from a place of venom or anything. If you weren't listening, you would have missed it. But there's the perception, you told us about the number of beds, and this woman is saying, now there's a hierarchy. I'm 16, I'm out of the house, I don't have a place to live. But she said, if you're trans, you get anything.
Well, I mean, something that we fought for at the Ali Forney Center was to create some trans-specific housing. So right now we have 6 beds that are dedicated to trans young women, which is a great accomplishment. But right now, almost all of the city support that we have for our housing is just for 16 to 20-year-olds. We and many of the other homeless youth programs actually work with people up to 24. If you're over 20, you have nothing but the adult shelter system. And trans women especially just face so much violence and harassment in the adult shelter system that overwhelmingly they don't feel that they can go to that system. And people are sleeping on the streets and the subways. A lot of people are couch surfing. We have not yet figured out in a really comprehensive way how to make just even the most basic shelter accessible to the most marginalized LGBT people in the city. And then for folks that are over 24, it's a disaster. You've just got these huge warehouse shelters that are just really, really terrifying for LGBT people in general, but especially for trans folks. So, you know, I just yesterday evening I was meeting with Javon Martin, you know, who's trying to get Princess Chiney Place up and running, which is
part of.
Which is so you know, which he envisions to be a housing program for homeless trans adults, and you know, I can't think of a more urgently needed endeavor in our city right now.
And by bringing up this point, I was not trying to talk or even highlight any dissension among the LGBTQ community, but to really highlight this sort of fight for resources when we are all, you just did the budgets, we're all fighting for this ever smaller piece of the pie, when in all actuality, it's a thing where if everyone gets more, everyone will have more. It's not diminishing returns. There's enough money out there. And Kenyon was the former director of Queers for Economic Justice. Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna go to you, Ritchie. I know you've been fighting for a long time for people in NYCHA and talking about the fact that there are poor people who have these basic human needs that aren't being met. And you just finished a budget, so how are we doing?
We're failing for the reason the demand for housing and for shelter far exceeds the supply. Now, politicians will often congratulate themselves and say, we're better than what you had before, but it still falls far short of where we need. I mean, what we have in New York City is a tale of two shelter systems, right? So if you're an adult, you can remain in the shelter for as long as you need to until you find permanent housing. But if you are a 16-year-old trans youth of color, you might be able to obtain a DYCD shelter bed for a maximum of 60 days, and then you're required to exit the system, even if it means you're thrown back into the streets. And for reasons of survival, you might exchange sex for a place to sleep or a place to eat, meaning you're more susceptible to substance abuse, more susceptible to STDs. And when you engage in survival sex, what follows from it is often interaction with the criminal justice system. Not to mention the fact that suicide is the leading cause of death among homeless youth, particularly LGBT youth. And so housing instability, the lack of access to temporary shelter and permanent housing, sets in motion a downward spiral of instability in every aspect of your life. So you can have all the laws in the world. Absolutely. We have a comprehensive human rights law here in New York City. You can have all the representation of LGBT people in the media, and yet you can still have deeply rooted inequality that's literally killing LGBT people of color every day.
So if we accept that and we're working from that point, we know that we're dealing with a structure of systems.
Right.
And there are certain people who have very real stakes in keeping those systems going. So I'm going to go to you now, Professor. What are the means for people who are in the LGBTQ community and the others who are still oppressed under those systems to dismantle them?
Well, we need good lawyers. I crank them out every year at Columbia Law School. We need good lawyers who work on this. We need good laws passed by good legislators. But those laws don't work if we don't have social movements that support them and that make those laws do work. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the regrettable place that we've ended up with Big Gay or Gay Inc. Is that
Big Gay.
Big Gay. That's what we call it. That's what we call it. Big
Who's
Gay.
he?
Well, the large, corporations that are setting the agenda within the LGBT community is that they're run by CEOs who could be running any other company. It just happens that they got a job running a gay organization. And we've professionalized our movement. And I have to say, we have too many lawyers running our movement. Marriage equality is something lawyers can pick off and fix. The stuff that you guys are all talking about, litigation, passing a particular law isn't going to fix it. We need a deep structural reforms in the way that we fund social services, but even more than that, along with that, we need social movements pushing our elected officials, pushing our judges, exacting a price from the institutions that are not supporting us and that don't understand or are working against the structures that harm us.
So I'm reminded of another article I read in preparation of this from a very sort of right-wing site that I don't need to mention. But in talking about the advances that have been made by the community, they said all of this hysteria over gay rights and this advancement is less Selma and more Salem. That we're in a moment of collective hysteria, and it was their desperation to push the boundaries as far as possible, as quickly as possible, may evidence the zeal of the terminally ill. Everything must be done today because there is no tomorrow. So what should be done today before we all collectively come to our senses and realize you should be fine with what you're given in terms of rights? What's the work to be done right now, 2 days out of Orlando?
I think we need to take to the streets. And we need to do vigils right now. We need to mourn collectively. And then we need to take to the streets and demand action. We need to show our strength, not just in the lawsuits we bring and the meetings that we have with members of Congress, but the degree to which we create discomfort. And the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, is a real inspiration for what could be a reinvigorated gay rights or LGBTQ movement to radicalize it and to make outrageous demands. Mm-hmm. We've been in this sort of honeymoon of, yay, they all finally love us. Well, they don't love all of us, right? And it's an opportunity that they love some of us to actually push the agenda of our politicians, our judges, and others in a direction that takes care of our most vulnerable.
And I think it's also important to point out that the Black Lives Matter movement itself, many of the figures in that movement are highly intersectionally attuned. Our queer people themselves are, I'm working on a profile right now on Elle Hearns, who is, a major organizer in Black Lives Matter and a Black trans woman herself. And one of the things that she talks about is just the fact that, that there is this sort of priority for non-minority concerns within LGBTQ politics. And I think that it's very important, just as the important figures in the Black Lives Matter movement are looking at queer issues and trans issues specifically, that we also do the same, that we do the converse in the LGBTQ movement, that we look at the most marginalized, intersectionally oppressed people and segment within our population.
So what, if any, place do you think civil disobedience and even outright violence might have in a movement for LGBTQ civil rights?
Well, as a legislator, I cannot condone violence, so that's, but I will say, to the point of I think the inside game is overrated.
Yeah.
And I think Black Lives Matters demonstrates the power and possibilities of agitation. I mean, would the governor had issued an executive order establishing a special prosecutor without Black Lives Matter? He didn't do that in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. You have Democrats and Republicans in Washington coalescing around some semblance of sentencing reform. That didn't happen in a vacuum. You even have some here in New York City. We still have broken windows policing, but there have been some attempts at mitigating its excesses. Like, all of that is a response to the agitation, to the grassroots power of the Black Lives Matter movement.
I also want to say, it's really important to highlight that there are certain sectors of the Black Lives Matter movement that are very affirming of all LGBT folks, right? Mm-hmm. But there are also sectors throughout the United States that are not. Mm-hmm. We need to hold them accountable, Mm-hmm. So to say that the Black Lives Matter is like this perfect movement, it is not. There's still a lot of work that has to get done.
What does holding them accountable look like?
Holding them accountable looks like calling them out when they're not, like when a Black trans sister is murdered and they don't show up to support a Black trans woman, hold them accountable. Let them know, like, listen, these are Black lives that are being slaughtered and murdered, and you're not showing up and showing your support. I think if anything, what happened in Orlando, what it shows is that people don't care about the nuances of who we are. All they know is that it's a club, there's an LGBTQ community that is in that one hub, so let's just wipe them all out. So the same thing has to be done when we talk to the Black Lives Matter movement, getting them to understand, like, The people who want to erase you, they want to erase us as well. And they're doing a good job of erasing Black trans women, you know, because of their silence. And they need to show their support a lot more than what they have been showing.
You wanted to say something else?
Yeah, and I don't even know how I can say it concisely, but I'll try. I think that for our movement to move forward to the next step, we have to fix our movement. Like, I think there's something broken about our movement, our LGBT movement. And, you know, I feel like, you know, there's this LGBT dream of equality and whatever, but I feel like I'm seeing an LGBT nightmare happen, which is that as some of the structures of legalized homophobia or, you know, anti-LGBT laws get undone, the more privileged parts of our community, like, are able to live lives that are kind of like, you know, the rest of the privileged society. Mm-hmm. And the folks who are people of color, who are poor, who are trans, are being left way behind, like way behind. And, you know, I see it so viscerally and in such a real way because I have to raise millions of dollars to house all the young people that I, you know, and I see like all the folks with money, you know, it's like white guys, mm-hmm. you know? And in a lot of ways, because they're funding our movement, it's like their agenda,
the agenda if you have the
has the power. Yeah. The money and power are just so intertwined.
So can I ask you, the day after marriage equality, if we're looking at the Fed, when it's the law of the land, the Supreme Court is acted, the day after that, does your job get harder or easier in terms of raising money?
In some ways, my job gets easier because so much money was getting poured into marriage equality that, like, you know, it opened up the pocketbooks a little bit. But there's a broader issue, which is that there's so much economic injustice that LGBT people experience who are of color, who are trans, who are women. And if our movement doesn't make it a core priority to address economic injustice, we're never going to fix this. Like, we're never going to fix this. And, you know, I thought it was heartbreaking that Queers for Economic Injustice went out of business like 2 or 3 years ago. Mm. You know, like, how can New York City not be able to, you know, we've been so focused on laws. And look, the unjust laws have to be undone. Yeah. But you know, I feel like part of the integrity and strength of any community is dollars, resources. And we have not, as a community and as a movement, been so focused on demanding that resources come to where they are needed the most, you know, with the poorest, the most marginalized parts of our community. I mean, the fact that you can have 200,000 homeless LGBT youth on the streets of our country and 4,000 beds for all homeless youth, about 400 of them dedicated to LGBT, that's just one lens to look at, like, the overwhelming injustice that we have with resources. And you know, people won't have power to set the agenda until the resources start getting redistributed. Mm-hmm. So I just think that's just so key and so critical.
And,
so, yeah.
And I was just going to say that, you know, that it is really important for people to move beyond themselves and their own positions within the community, you know, just because we are dealing with these structures. I am, you know, like, I'm a person who identified as a gay man before I, you know, I disclosed as transgender and transitioned, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've been exposed to gay communities that have really sort of like isolated themselves from the larger struggles of LGBT people. And that has, you know, we've made progress in some cases, you know, and we do have people within the community who are not like that, but I do think that we need so many more people who are able to see beyond their specific positions, you know, who are able to just kind of like look at somebody else in the community and say, this person is objectively in such a, you know, such an oppressed, marginalized position compared to me, and that I should pour my resources, you know, try to pour as many of my resources as possible in order to help people in that position.
So I'm wondering, just from your perspective, Ritchie, what does the landscape look like when we look at it through the lens of re-racking what the priorities are? If we take the center position of someone who is a person of color, who doesn't come from a privileged background, who still has very real needs and goals and aspirations for their own life.
So what's the question? I'm not clear.
What does the Pride 2020 look like then when we look through that lens, when we're not looking at the donor list of the people who had the marriage money, but if the person who is the most marginalized gets to set the agenda, where do we go?
I mean,
what does that look like?
Reality is there is look, I want economic justice to be the central focus of the LGBT movement. There is a moneyed constituency for marriage equality, right? There is no moneyed constituency for economic justice. So you can rely on the donor class to fund campaigns for marriage equality. There is no donor class for social and economic equality for LGBT people of color, which means that the government has to play a greater role, right? The government can ensure that the LGBT community gets its fair share of resources. And even as a legislator, I want to say that I think legislation is overrated. I think people often see their salvation in legislation, that if only we amend the Civil Rights Act and give protected class status to LGBT people, then all will be well. That's nonsense. Like, laws have limitations. Laws will only get you so far without a change in culture and without ensuring that the LGBT community is receiving its fair share of resources.
So as we sit here now, 2016.
But I think, can I actually make one more point?
Please.
That the activist world needs to be more aggressive in holding elected officials accountable. Do not treat us like royalty. We are public servants. There are too many activists who care more about their relationships with elected officials than advancing the cause. They mistake proximity to power for actual power. It is a delusion.
Excuse me. Said the man who's an elected official.
I'll give you one example, and this is going to be a controversial example.
Share two, then.
I'll start with the Clintons, and I want to start with this. Like, Donald Trump represents everything that is hideous in this country, so I will happily vote for Hillary Clinton. But I see gay people treat Hillary Clinton with a level of adulation.
Yeah.
What have the Clintons done they deserve? We should support them in November. But I'm not clear what Hillary Clinton has done.
Well, she evolved on gay marriage in 2011.
But is that our standard? Like, I mean, if we don't respect ourselves enough, then who will respect us? How can you expect respect from elected officials when we lack the self-respect to hold elected officials accountable? I think we should, you know where I stand, so. I can be on all day.
I was waiting for the second example, a little bit more local, but you want to leave it at Hillary.
What's the?
Well, you said you had an example, and I asked for two, and you started with one.
I just see too many. It's more establishment activists who are just tripping over themselves to fawn over the governor and the mayor, when in fact they're presiding over a status quo that is starving LGBT communities of color of resources. There are people who are dying, and their deaths are preventable. It's a public policy choice that elected officials have made, and no one is holding those elected officials accountable. There should be a universal right to youth shelter. Right? If you're a young person, you should be assured of permanent housing. We have an $82 billion budget. We have the resources to provide permanent housing. What we're lacking is political will.
What Ritchie's talking about, and I'm sorry to
No, not at all, please.
It happened last night. Somebody that I've worked really close with, an organization that we've worked closely with to advocate for housing for youth has been Vocal New York. And, Vocal has been really aggressive about holding Governor Cuomo's feet to the fire to keep his promise to do a massive investment in AIDS housing. And there was a big announcement about it on Gay Pride Day, and the money didn't show up in the budget. So, last night, Jawanza Williams, who is this, great young activist, was at the vigil at Stonewall, and when Cuomo spoke, he raised his mouth and he said, you need to keep your promise. This is violence too, that there are homeless people with AIDS in the streets without access to housing. And, everybody around him shouted him down and shut him up, and it was like big Cuomo is up there and we must bow down. And so you know, what she's talking about is just, I just had to interrupt because I felt really bad for Jawanza, and I was really proud of him for having the courage to do that.
I also want to say it's important, you know, we can't forget about folks who've aged out of these programs. You know, not only am I proud to be affiliated with Housing Works, I'm also the executive director of NYTAG, and I deal with community members who have aged out of various programs, Forney, Hedrick Martin, and they've aged out and there's no place for them to go. Yeah. So we got to make sure that we're ensuring like this continuum of care throughout people's lives and not just having various demographics being prized over other demographics, but making sure that all demographics are invested in and that they have a fair chance of folks being able to mobilize around them. You know, I'm very passionate around legislation, as folks around on the panel have been saying, is very important, but it can take years. Like immediate action, group economics, social economics, that's where a lot of the work that we have to do. We need to start having those conversations, but also making sure that we have funding that goes into that, because there are community members who, they can't wait another year for legislation, you know, but if we get together and we mobilize as a community, intersectional community, we can invest in creating opportunities that they don't have to be dependent on like the welfare system, you know, but it starts with everyone in this room doing their part to make sure like when they meet with their legislators, they tell their legislators why it's important for them to invest in economic opportunities for our community.
Well, speaking of starting with everyone in this room, we've come to the period where we do invite you to make your way to either side of the aisle if you have a question that you'd like to share with the panel. So there's a microphone over there, and there's one over here. And again, we are taking tweets and all that jazz with the hashtag #BeHeard. So while folks are making their way down, I just want to keep things here with you for a second. We spoke about this need for that gap care and people who can't wait a year. So I just wanted to touch on this notion, especially at Housing Works, where for a large segment of the community, particularly for African American men in Brooklyn, HIV/AIDS has not become a health crisis anymore as so much a social justice epidemic.
Yeah. So what is your question around?
So I'm saying, how do we get to this place and how do we get ourselves out of it? When Ritchie said, there's lots of money, but there's not the political will to hold people accountable who hold the purse strings.
Right. Well, I mean, first we have to address social factors that people don't get HIV because they're black or gay or trans, and just really understanding like it's a process. Mm-hmm. And understanding like even my years of being at Housing Works, one of the main things I loved about Housing Works is their job training program. So there's opportunities even within like our organization for people who are on welfare to transition into a living wage job with good health benefits. But it's really a lot of this work is about accountability and holding our community members accountable, because I know quite a few community members who, and I also reside in Brooklyn, that have these conversations and expect so much from CBOs. But we also have to make sure that we're holding these clients accountable and letting them know that they have to do their part, you know. So it's not just a one-sided issue where CBOs have to make room for community members, but making sure that we're being held accountable, the community members are being held accountable. That's really important.
All right, to community members, I'm looking at you. You want to step up to the mic and share your name and your question.
Hi, my name is Ashley Romero.
Ashley.
My question is this. When I was getting ready for this panel, I picked up one of the little cards for it, and I was reading it, and it said National Gay Pride Month. I'm a bisexual trans woman. I'm not gay. Where is my pride? And in a community that is supposed to fight for me, where there's a vigil at Stonewall to support the victims of Orlando, where one of my sisters was raped this year, how is it that I'm supposed to make sure that my voice is heard? I'm tired of wearing a target on my back. I don't want to be special. I don't want to be lauded or have special privilege. But how do I make sure that I have as much say and as much voice in a community as the gay, rich, white men who are the ones who set the agenda for it?
Absolutely. Thank you for taking the first step here and addressing that publicly. So No easy answer there. Do you want to start, Professor? Hot seat.
I feel like I'm in law school. I'm getting called on.
I knew you were ready.
You know, when I was coming up, we regarded bisexual people as just uncommitted or somehow were traitors. You know, you had to pick a team and you had to stick with your team. And in some respects, I think the big gay has retained that kind of perspective, that people who don't fit into normative heterosexuality, which is the dominant ethos in this country, need to stick together in political ways, certainly in legal ways, and in the ways we do our activism. And it may mean we need more bisexual people in these organizations and more people who are bisexual having a voice in how we set the agenda. But as I see it, it's not so much that one needs to pick a team anymore, but that we need to understand that we have a common enemy who expects all of us to have our loves and our lives to line up in a particular old-fashioned heterosexual way.
And doesn't it seem like there's something broken if the gays have had their victory, so they sit this one out, so the trans people get to step forward and have their moment? Is the bisexual transgender person supposed to get in line behind them and wait the next 40 years to have their moment? Are we so stuck in this cycle of one and done that we can't be a collective and work together on those rights?
Well, it's the tyranny of identity politics that keeps us from seeing what we have in common with each other, and it keeps us from really calling out what the underlying power is that's suppressing us, rather than getting something for us, whatever the us might be in a particular case. And usually the us is defined in one singular way that leaves out race, that leaves out class, leaves out all sorts of other complicated issues. So identity politics, I think, is a dead end as a way of doing politics. And there are many, many groups, many individuals who I think are harmed by it.
Councilmember.
To your question, how do you get your voice heard? Speak louder.
Yeah.
Don't be polite. Defer to no one.
I can do that.
That's my advice, I think.
Yeah.
That's the only way we'll be heard.
But I also, I think it's really important that other people, that other people are able to sort of support that voice, right? That people who find themselves with a surplus for themselves of either material or emotional resources can find ways to ask. A lot of people, after Orlando, have been saying, please, please reach out to me, or please reach out to queer people, in your circle, and support them, support us, because I do really think that, in a lot of ways, when people are in positions that are extremely marginalized, it requires a lot of resources for you to advocate for yourself, and you can't always do that, and it's very important for a broader community to be able to help you.
Yeah. I'm gonna go to you. Share your name and your question.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Gibbs from education.com. I moved to New York, and that's when my activism started. Meredith, I really like what you said about the different boxes that we have in our LGBTQ community. So growing up a singer in choral organizations, when I moved to New York, I wanted to find an organization where I could practice that and represent the LGBTQ community. And I found it, and I won't name the name of the group. But being in that space, which is dominated by rich white men, me being on the front line as a person of color within that space, how do you navigate within the box? I can't leave the group because I love it, but I'm surrounded by people that don't understand the struggle and refuse to acknowledge it. And we're all under the guise of equality and yeah, we love you and this, but then when it comes to real issues, it's just like, no, whatever.
I think we're picking on rich white men. I feel bad.
Is there an answer somewhere in there?
Well, I mean, immediately when you say when you said that, I am the only at the moment the only openly trans employee, at least in Buzzfeed New York. We have a couple of other trans employees in other offices, and the thing that I would say is that I have found sources of support within my organization, and at times, very, very surprising ones, ones that I didn't necessarily expect when I started working there. And I do, I do personally very much experience the alienation, and so finding ways to, to sort of like be in that space, be in the position that you're in, be at times feeling tokenized, at times feeling like, like you're the only person and nobody understands you, holding that position, and at the same time, like finding the ways for you to be able to do it, right? Going to parties that are, that with just your trans friends, or, finding those people who are willing, who you can cry to, who you can chat with, and that will always support you in those environments, I think is really, really important. And if you can't find that in the space that you're in, I think it's very important to talk to people in that space, talk to the people in power and say, if you're saying that it's important for people of color or whatever marginalized position it is to be here, it's important for me to be supported.
Thank you.
Brian.
Hey, Brian, how you doing?
I'm well, thank you.
My name is Brian. I'm a proud member of BRIC and producer here. What I wanted to ask you guys was, do you feel that people are confusing kind of like representation with activism? Because what I feel like I see a lot of is a lot of like, okay, we're talking about it, we're having this narrative, we're hashtagging, we showed up to the walk or whatever, but then nothing sort of happening after that. And for me, I'm turned off going to walks and vigils and marches, because I kind of feel like, okay, NYPD probably arranged this because they know that when it's all over, like everyone's like, I did my part, So I was just wondering, what do you guys sort of think about like that line of sort of like talking about it and starting the conversation and actually like activism?
You're still accepting volunteers, aren't you?
Yeah, I feel like we're in this, I don't want to get into this thing of like an older person, talking down on millennials or whatever, which seems to be like a stereotype of its own right now. But
however,
well,
careful.
I feel like what I've seen, and it probably crosses across many generations, but I feel like what is considered activism, a lot of it to me seems like striking progressive poses in social media. Right. And it's almost like, the selfie notion has just kind of like, infected even activism. To me, activism is like you get really committed to something and you don't let go of it until you win. Like you just keep fighting and fighting and fighting, and you do your rallies, you do your petitions, you demand that the government does what the government does, and you just keep fighting and fighting and fighting. So a lot of it just has to come from within you.
You brought something up that I've been thinking, which is like generational, because like back in the day, if you went to a protest, you knew that you might get dog sicked on you, or you knew that, hoses might get turned on you, or you knew that you might go, it was a very imminent like threat to do this. And now you're kind of like, okay, I can go to Union Square and be a part of this, and I'm not necessarily in danger.
But to make it more succinct, council member, you're the legislator, you're the elected, you write the laws, you help allocate budgets. What is effective activism that gets noticed with you and your colleagues?
I thought I made that clear earlier. No.
Say it twice.
I would say agitate. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, is as definitive an example of the power of agitation as anything I've seen, because LGBT people of color is not the default priority of the political establishment, right? Our people will fade into the background unless we make our presence known and unless we assert our right to be heard. Mm-hmm. I'm repeating myself, but I believe that.
I think we're going to go to the other side of that generation gap now. Sage.
Hey, I'm Michael Adams, and I really appreciated the comment that you made earlier about folks aging out of programs and aging out of services. I wanted to ask a question that expands on that a little bit, because I think there's another reality, which is that many of the folks who are old enough to have been fighting the fight for our communities for decades, in fact, are treated like they've aged out of our community, right? And We've got folks in this room who have been fighting these fights for 40 years, 50 years. We have organizations like SAGE and Griot Circle in this house who are, working with our elders. And I wanted, Ritchie has been a huge champion for LGBTQ elders in the city, many of whom are people of color, are trans, are living on the edge financially, are completely invisible, even in our own community. And so I want to ask if any of the panelists want to say a little bit about where our elder pioneers fit into this picture that you're talking about.
I just want to say, when I first came into this movement way back in the day, it was intergenerational. Now it's become more compartmentalized and more like a nonprofit industrial complex where I'll take care of this population, you take care, and we need to get back to being intergenerational spaces because I learned so much from the older generations. And I feel like there's a disconnect that happens now with a lot of folks who feel like nobody came before them. And we need to make sure that we're creating spaces where getting older is not a stigma, but that that older folks still play an integral part in these movements, and there's still a lot of folks who have aged out who are still beating the pavements. They're the main ones, sounding the alarm when issues are occurring throughout, the city. So it's really important that everybody do their part to make sure, like, if you have folks who have aged out, that you don't make them feel like this is no longer their movement. And now I also want to say, like, especially with Black trans women, right? Black trans women, like, the life expectancy is 35 years old. So by the time most trans women who are Black reach 35, they are already seen as elders in the community. So what happens a lot is people look up to them for all this history. And at 35, there's so much more history out there that folks who are 35 don't know about. So you got to make sure that we are creating intergenerational spaces that include folks who are not valued in a way that someone who is 16 to 24 is. And it's really just important for everyone in this space to, like, do their part of, like, just making sure you are listening and you're inclusive of folks who have aged out of the program.
Well, to the end of being listening and inclusive, you've set me up perfectly. We here at BRIC did get the chance to pay homage to a person who has been in the fight and doing the work since the 1960s, both in Philadelphia and here in New York City. She's a Brooklynite. Jean Wimberly was recently profiled as part of our, take that. Jean Wimberly was recently profiled as part of our Be Heard series, and this is just a little snippet of that, honoring the work and the woman. Have a look.
Salsa Soul was developed because of women's lack of services, discrimination, lack of health care, that we just needed to be with each other. The network, to sit down and talk about some of the problems that we ran into. I marched out of my shoes. We were building a movement. It was always a struggle. And, how to be yourself without all this discrimination that that we faced on a daily basis. Today is trying to bring people back. Where are we? What's our community like?
So Jean, I should say, is just north of 35, and there's a wealth of knowledge and experience and humor and wit that's so deep there, and I encourage all of you to visit our YouTube channel and see that in its entirety. It's worth the 7 minutes that you're going to spend getting a little glimpse into her life and her history. So I'm going to go to you right now. Share your name and your question, please.
Hi, my name is Morel. I have a lot of questions and also problems with sort of the setup that we're given. I feel like this problem and our movement are almost synonyms, and that it's not really being shared globally in a way that I feel would really speak well to how much effort has been put in, how much life has been given to our struggle. And I just want to talk, I overheard these teachers talking. I was out in Fort Greene, which is right around here, and they were talking about how their students don't feel like they have accountability for their education. And I just couldn't help but think that had a lot to do with what had just happened in Orlando, that we're not really fixing anything. And I guess my question is, how can this movement stop being only our problem? Because I wake up the same way that my straight friends wake up, except I'm gay, and I have all of this baggage to filter through and in order to process my reality, but it seems like it's really easy to be on the other side of the coin. So I guess that's my question. How can we transfer some of that over to people who have all the power already?
I would just say, like, one of the things we have to start doing is, like, making sure that we are operating in intersectional spaces. And that is something I've been very passionate about. Too often we operate in exclusively gay spaces or exclusively trans spaces. And we got to make sure that we are creating spaces where we are inviting our allies into those spaces to know our issues. And that's where it starts, really, is having that conversation.
So intersectionality is like the buzzword that comes up at every single time we talk about social movements or communities that have been really demoralized or marginalized. And I sort of want to get at that because it's a buzzword, but it's nothing new. No one's ever accomplished anything without having been attacked from all sides. So can we sort of give some hope to people when we talk about intersectionality? Every advance that we've had has been from people who've been besieged on all sides. Yes, can we agree from that conceit and move forward?
Well, it was my colleague Kim Crenshaw who sort of launched that term along with Paula Giddings and a few other scholars. And I think it has become, it's both a very productive term and an important one, but it's become a kind of empty placeholder that gives you a pass from having to think critically.
Say, oh, it's hard. There's poverty meeting race, meeting sexual violence, or people being marginalized. And to pack that in the intersectionality box and leave it there because it's hard is doing a disservice to everyone.
Well, and what happens in that box, and I think that's part of your question, is for me there are these really dynamic moments where people who are different come together, and we necessarily want to be working with people who are different from ourselves. And part of what we want to do is have them know us, not be afraid of us, care about us, but I also want to make them uncomfortable. And I think part of our job is to make them uncomfortable with their privilege. And sometimes you do that first, and sometimes you do it after they love you, or at least like you a bunch, right? And I think that's the creative kind of tension and dynamism of activism. And as Michael Adams was asking us about our elders, I mean, the job isn't just to be nice to them, although that would be good. We need to learn from them. These are folks who have been doing this work of wanting others to like them, but making them enormously uncomfortable for years and years. They are a resource in our community. So intersectionality for me is this kind of uncomfortable tension between love and challenge.
Right. And I think it happens at a human level. Like I talk about this, I encounter a lot of people who talk about intersectionality and who are, who in principle are very, talk a good game in terms of, equal rights for LGBT people, et cetera. But when you actually look at the people that they interact with, their friends, people they're close to, it becomes, a lot of times you see that they don't actually have a lot of contact with people in those marginalized positions. And at least for me, I don't know for other people, the people I do care about at a human level are people that I invest, time and resources and help with. And so I think that's one of the places that it starts, right, is in our real human interactions with each other, so that then that straight, white, male person, lends you money because they care about you when you're, when as has happened to me a couple of times in my life, right? And are able to sort of like share their resources in ways that they wouldn't otherwise potentially.
Well, speaking of intersectionality, I've got something else for you to see. Like, imagine being a Brooklyn-born gay man of Indian descent who happens to be Muslim, and being an artist and living with your parents and figuring all of that out, reconciling your religion with your sexuality, your identity, and just washing dishes under your parents' roof. So we have the story of Muhammad Fayez, who is an artist who is profiled as part of our Be Heard series that we're going to share now.
My name is Mohammed. I'm 25 years old, born in Brooklyn, and I'm an illustrator. A lot of my artwork is about intimacy. So even if it's something simple like this guy over here, this is like a real scene that's from like my real life, but not me always. I always try to have like stand-ins for stories, like my own stories or stories that I know. Just seeing these images kind of reminds me of the world that I want to see. The world that I do see, right? Sisterhood and stuff and things that I feel a part of. I'm part of a bigger picture. We can't always be stuck on what we're up against. I think we need to also look at what does the future look like for us and for future generations. So my family is Muslim. We are Muslim Indians, which is always like a little strange for people to hear, but it's actually very common. Islam has played a huge role in my life, especially because it's so cultural. It's not just a religion that it dictates so much of our life, of our culture, of our daily routine. My earliest memory of like knowing that I was gay goes back to like the 8th grade, I think. I had a crush on like my math teacher. That's around puberty, so like around 12, 13. I knew that it was wrong. I knew that it felt wrong, but it also like made a lot of sense to me. I think confronting that kind of like self-hatred of like wanting to smother this thing came with just like teenage rebellion, like 16, 17, realizing that like there's this huge world out there that I'm gonna like thrive in, and that might mean losing something as strong as institutional as my faith. That's been there since day one, that has carried me through everything, knowing that like if I have to lose that for me to kind of feel free, that's what that's gonna take. It's always been as part of my identity, but I stopped practicing for a few years because there was no reconciliation between the two for me. It was like, you're either gay or you're either Muslim, and there's no such thing as a gay Muslim. Also the thought of like, it's not just like, oh, I'm leaving my religion, it's like, I'm leaving my religion to possibly one day burn in hell for this.
So again, you can visit our YouTube channel and see that in its entirety, and I can let you know that unlike a lot of young people, Muhammad has found some peace with his parents, and they do coexist together, and it is his life, and you should check out the video. There's some great stuff there. I'm gonna go to you.
Hi, Tanya Walker. Yeah, I'm one of those people that's been erased out of the gay rights movement and out of the trans rights movement. At first, I fought as a lesbian at Staten Island College in 1994 for Judge Burstein, who was running for Attorney General, and Guy V. Molinari made some remarks against her that I didn't feel were right. I was fighting for her, and very few lesbians and gays came out to protest with me, and I had a sign. And they made me head of the LGBT organization because everybody was in the closet. I feel like one of those people that's been erased. And, you know, I fought for Judge Burstein because I felt like the borough president of Staten Island's remarks were, you know, they weren't true. I felt like Judge Burstein could rule the universe. I didn't feel like she could just be Attorney General of New York State. But because she was a lesbian, he felt like she wasn't, you know, qualified to be Attorney General. So I fought for her, but I'm still invisible behind that. So I'm trying to get it into the center, into the archives or whatever. Because I have a newspaper article. I made the front page of the Staten Island Advance in 1994, holding up a sign that gays and lesbians live in your boroughs too, when there was no trans, and there was no rights, and everybody was scared still, and even in the 90s. Yeah. So, as a result of this panel, what do you panelists hope to see changed? And are there any concrete plans set in place to make changes to what's going on right now? Because trans people of color are dying while we're sitting up here, while we're pretty. And another thing, how many of you who are non-trans took a trans person out to lunch or dinner and walked down the street with a trans person that doesn't look like our celebrities, with $250,000 worth of surgery on their faces, $50,000 dresses, $250,000 cars, and gracing the cover of magazines? How many of you people who are non-trans on this panel have gone out to eat with a trans woman? And if you haven't, take me.
There you go.
I would love to have lunch with you. Just saying, I don't qualify because I am trans, but let's.
Free lunch is free lunch. I think you should.
I'd be happy to go to dinner. I just can't. I have to treat because I can't accept gifts. So.
Oh, thank you.
Even better, Mr. Legislator.
Just want to also acknowledge, like, Ms. Tanya Walker has been amazing, not only from the very beginning of the movement, but she's also been significant. Many years she was our driver, taking many of us up to Albany, driving us up in a van, you know, and so she's, you know, so she's still very active. So that's really important to understand. Like, you have these trans women who are seen as not aging out of programs, but they're still viable and they're still doing amazing things. And Tanya Walker is one of those persons, you know. I just really feel that...
You'll accept a round of applause instead of dinner for tonight. You can take that.
But I just really feel like it goes back to, like, making sure, like, we, you know, who have aged out, we do a better job of working together and highlighting our issues. Right. But also, like, you know, in making sure that these spaces are not just spaces where people come and hear from us, but it's like a call to action for people to speak to us after this event to see how they can get involved with us.
Yeah, dialogue. We're about dialogue. Please.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm not saying my full name because I'm engaged in various kind of radical activism and I don't really want my identity to come out. For example, I was actually almost arrested last night when we took to the streets after the Orlando shooting, and the police were actually like beating us up with horses and stuff. Okay, so anyway, I just want to say that I've also had bad experience with my mom. She's a big liberal, like big supporter of Hillary Clinton, and she told me not to use the word queer because she said that would like make some person in Iowa vote for Trump. Just all kinds of horrible stuff like that. She said the heteronormativity wasn't real because heterosexual people are the norm. She wants me to be all normal and stuff. How do we do? I'm starting to think that like these sort of liberal fake allies are like even worse than the reactionaries who openly preach death to us.
All right, I'm going to
I just want to say, what can we do to sort of combat this kind of liberalism?
Well, we can begin by letting me paraphrase Dorothy Parker by saying, heterosexuality is not normal. It's just common. Thank you, Jonathan Leaf, who wrote that earlier this week, reminded me of it. But to his question, we're going to leave it with Ms. Parker? Okay, we'll see you after.
Combat stupidity, is that the question?
Well, it's a reference, of course, to an essay by Mao Zedong. I mean, that might be controversial, but I think it was a pretty good writer, to be honest. Not a very good leader, of course, but you know.
I mean, I think it's really important to remind people that it's one, that it's one thing to sort of espouse a belief, and it's another thing to live it. You know, like every day, encounter people who celebrate trans people, who celebrate trans celebrity, but, aren't necessarily there when there is a crisis, when people are having a hard time, aren't there, when people need help. And I think that discrepancy really needs to be addressed among this sort of class of people.
All right, I'm going to go to you. Please share your name and your question.
Good evening. My name is Larry Kovacs. I'm a former member of the Gay Liberation Front. I don't know how many people know about that. I also want to preface, to get out of the way, that I'm a gay white man, in order to say that I acknowledge my privilege.
Are you rich?
What? Unfortunately, okay. I'm not rich. And, you know, I'll take privilege any way I can. Being positive. Now, first, I'm glad that Adam spoke, because the first thing I want to say is, you don't realize how good you have it, you know? And that's why I say white man, because people say, well, you're a white man, how would you know? I mean, I grew up in a generation where the cops came into a bar and we had to all stop dancing, you know? And the reason I joined GLF, it didn't make sense to me. I mean, you're grown, I mean, I was like 20 then. Grown men take that? I thought the purpose of being an adult is that we could be free. It just didn't make sense. And also, I was an obvious I got beat up every day of my life. So listen, I'm not diminishing where you're at, but like, hey, we have grown. I was a little bit upset when you were talking about, you know, legislative action isn't everything. But I've been living with AIDS for 36 years, and I would not be alive if it wasn't for legislation. But we had to fight for it. Now, I am not happy where the movement is, because I think we're creating a lot of guilt, and we're causing people to be apologetic. And all that does is create liberals. What it does is people now are so careful what they're going to say. So you think that, you know, they could say, I support civil rights, but our struggle is way beyond civil rights. Another thing.
Listen, this is the pioneer. You get your another thing. Give it to us.
The other thing, you know, we have to stop talking at people and start talking to people. You know, I mean, people do not understand who we are. And one thing that bothers me about the whole way Orlando was framed is that it's immigration or gun control. The bottom line is a man who happened to be Islam was with his kids and saw two men kiss. They may have been groping, and it made him say, I want to kill faggots. Now, the reason that's important, it holds everyone accountable. Straight people who say they see it as a civil rights issue, I ask them, how would you feel as a parent having your kids don't see two men kissing? It's okay as long as they sterilize us. They make us a generic gay, you know, but, you know, we are more multifaceted. To get back to what I said earlier, I'm on a lot of blogs, and a little bit about transgender. I was at one point of transitioning, but I had a therapist that said, you know.
I think we're going to have to find you on the blog. We're running out of time, and we got
Well, let me just
people.
finish the question.
Yeah.
There was a man that was having a lot of questions, and a lot of transgender was just attacking, you know, and I just feel that, you know, we have so much anger, but where are we to allow people to speak and feel like they're not going to be attacked? That's why I had a preface saying I'm a white man, and I shouldn't have to do that. We have to give everyone the place to speak. What, as a community, how open do we allow people to say things that are not popular, which will allow where they may feel alienated and yelled at? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to think that we created that kind of space tonight, but moving forward, this notion of safe space has really been put into sharp focus with what happened in Orlando. And you've created some safe spaces in the Bronx, Housing Works at Alley Forney, but this need for safe space to have this dialogue, to disagree, to strengthen each other. Where are our safe spaces?
I just really think we need to also be careful when we say safe space, because we can only create safer spaces, right? We can't really, I mean, the folks at Post thought that was a safe space.
Yeah.
You know, and so we have to make sure that we're not guaranteeing safe space, because we can't guarantee safe space, but that we need to make sure that make sure that all our spaces are safer for people to be in, you know, but I feel that we really, when we do that, we set our community up so when things like this happen, then it's this frustration like, oh, this is supposed to be a safe space and this happened. And so it's really important that we understand, like, we can only create safer spaces. You know, I can't guarantee, like, we can go into a movie theater.
Well, I understand there's no safe space if you want to create safer spaces, but what's the alternative? Like, you can't congregate 10 or more together because we become a target for a self-hating person who exercises his own demons with an assault weapon?
Right. No, I'm just saying, like, simply, it's all semantics, right? But it's really about making sure we have that conversation with our community members. Like, we want to guarantee that these spaces are safe, right. but there's no guarantee in saying that this is a safe space.
Right.
So we can only create.
It's not a
safer
force
spaces.
field.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what all I'm saying.
Well, I also think I hear among my students are these demands for safe spaces in the university context.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're really saying is that they don't want to be confronted with ideas that are uncomfortable to them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, nobody should be
This is
physically.
not just an exclusive purview of the right.
Exactly, exactly. And you know, I teach queer theory, I teach LGBT history, I teach gender, I teach racial history, and a lot of this stuff is uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And there aren't obvious right answers to how to explain history, to explain complex social problems. But I often find myself shut down by students who want a trigger warning. They want some way in which they're not going to have to participate in a difficult conversation. So many of our questioners tonight have said, I actually want to have uncomfortable conversations within the community, within my workplace, and I'm not sure how to make that happen because I get shut down all the time. So I think safety is a term that gets overused. I mean, no one's physical body should be assaulted for sure.
Right.
That's one version of safety, but I think we ought to be open to uncomfortable conversations that challenge the kind of privilege we have.
And yet at the same time, you know, like I also think that there is a lot, you know, there is a tension, that there isn't a simple, easy answer, right? You know, because I have also seen situations where, you know, where it becomes very difficult for people to feel comfortable having had the experiences that they've had, you know, be able to feel like they can
You bring
participate.
all the pain from previous hurts.
And I think that, and I do think that there is a lot of space for dialogue in terms of this, you know, so I'm not a person who necessarily always puts a trigger warning or who supports trigger warnings unequivocally, but I'm also a person who understands that, you know, there are times, and I would like to be aware of what it is that I'm watching or what I'm about to see, right? And I think building that trust among teachers and students, among white people and non-white people, among majority people and minorities, I think is really, really important. And also just really, really emphasizing that there really isn't an easy, simple, you know, like one cover-all solution, that it does entail a lot of dialogue and work.
I think that there needs to be like a balance.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I think that when you know, you're able to live in a psychologically healthy space, like you can go home at night to a place where you're safe, affirmed, loved. And in some ways, I think that gives you the strength and the courage to then go out the next day into spaces all over the world where you're not as safe and where you have to kind of fight for some justice. And I don't think the fight for justice is ever going to feel safe.
Yeah.
So, you know, like at the Ali Forney Center, the young people that we work with have been under siege in so many ways. So I think just having a space where they can go home at night to lay their head down and not have to worry about anybody hating on them is profound. And having just opened like our trans housing program, like the young women there say, I mean, it's just such an amazing thing to be in a space where they just don't have to worry about anybody else's bullshit. But the only reason that's valuable fundamentally is so that they can have the strength to then go out into the unsafe world and stand up for themselves.
Sir, I'm going to come to you with the caution that we really need to keep it tight so we can get to everyone's question.
Okay, my question, well, it's not really a question, it's more like a point of information. My name is Eric with a Z. Older people explain that joke to millennials. I'm going to be, the point is, the point I want to make is, I know why the establishment was fighting for marriage equality before anything else. In 2003, after the Supreme Court ruled on Lawrence v. Texas and struck down all the state sodomy laws, the radical right said, oh my God, how can we discriminate against gays now? Oh, wait, no, they want to get married, we'll pass DOMAs. We'll pass DOMAs all along the state. And so that's in the next year, 2004, on the ballot in November were over a dozen state DOMA laws. And it was also, I mean, talk about like California Prop 8 led to the black community coming in and voting for both Obama and Prop 8. A lot of people voted for both. It's like it fed on each other. A lot of people who wanted to vote for Bush also voted for DOMAs, and a lot of people who wanted to go vote for DOMAs also voted for Bush. In brief, I also have a theory as to why our community is falling in line behind Clinton. It goes back to the 90s after the Clintons passed, DOMA.
Yeah, bring it to the point for me.
Okay, after the Clintons passed DOMA and Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a lot of gay people said, no, no, no more, no with the Clintons. But then the Monica Lewinsky scandal happened, and nobody knows what it's like.
Oh,
Nobody
now
knows.
you've got me to Lewinsky. Okay, I'm
What?
gonna ask that we continue later because I want to go to this guy. But thank you for
I'm
sharing.
sorry, but a lot of people, gay people fell in line behind that because nobody knows what it's like being
Gotcha.
persecuted for sex like us. So, okay.
I see you on that. Thank you.
My name is Jim Forat. I'm 75 years old this month. I live on less than $1,000 a month Social Security, which is like many activists that gave up everything to make a world safer for people like yourselves. I want to say to the younger people, try to have a conversation with us. Sometimes we don't use the same words, but underneath of it, we have the same ideas. For example, gender variance was a word that we used in 1969. Gender free was a word that we used in 1969. You use different language today, and sometimes this language gets in the way of us having a conversation. Try to speak to an older person, particularly an older activist. Sit down and listen to each other. I'm committed to that. I'm committed to speaking to that. But I want to challenge each of you in this particular moment of Orlando. I'm very, very upset by the way I've seen this spun on cable television and in the news media. Rarely have I heard the word homophobia or internalized homophobia. I do not know a gay man of any generation that has not had to deal with internalized homophobia. I too, like Larry, was in the Gay Liberation Front in 1969. The third night of Stonewall, we started chanting, "Come out, come out, come out," for a very good reason. Because if you don't come out, you are caught up in that sinkhole. That father of that man who shot up the club, listen to the way he talks, and you will understand part of what that kid went through, regardless of his conflicts over his sexual identity or sexual orientation. So I'm challenging each and every one of you to bring into the conversation, every single time we talk about Orlando, the words homophobia. Guns kill. Homophobia causes hate, and that hate causes people to pick up guns. But if you leave out, last night at the rally, we had all the politicians. One person said the word lesbian, Rosie Mendez. No one said the word gay. We heard a lot of trans, and a lot of it was politically correct, paying homage to trans. It wasn't doing anything for the trans. I don't know how many people knew how to get home or took someone out to eat last night who was obviously poor and hungry, who was there in that rally, who identified as a trans. It's cheap talk to use the right language. But what the practice is and the action is what's important. So please, 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 help this old man to hear the word homophobia, internalized homophobia, in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. You're going to be our last question, I believe, so please, come on.
Thank you.
Step a little closer.
Yes, I'd like to say that I'm from Somalia and grew up in an Islamic household. So with all the restrictions that comes from, I really identified, although I'm not LGBTQ, I identified with that community, and I was always accepted by that community. And the rest of the world could really take a note from that kind of acceptance. What I would like to say is that people talk about homophobia, but there's a problem with like the heterosexual community that they think that they're not, just because you're not hating a person from that community or don't have anything bad to say that they are. Like I've heard people say the terms like phrases like, oh, I don't have a problem with gay people, as if they had a right to have a problem with it. So I would like to say when it's not popular, like, last week it was popular to be pro-gorilla, so like if it's not popular in the news, what can a heterosexual person do on a day-to-day basis and be consistent in supporting the LGBT community?
Claps for the ally. So what is the responsibility? What can the straight people do, whether they're allies or tolerant, or just they don't have a problem with the gays?
Straight cisgender people.
Straight cisgender people.
It starts with education. We need to educate people about what homophobia means. It does not mean necessarily active hatred, but if the status quo is homophobic, then your passive acceptance of that status quo is homophobic.
Okay, how about that? Kiara, you have a thought?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many layers to that question. I feel it first starts just by having these conversations, and understanding like you have people who have been indoctrinated because of various religions of feeling a certain lifestyle is superior to others. And so it really comes from like making sure that people understand that all lives are valuable and that we should not be living in this society that says certain lives are disposable. And it's really important that, it starts like with just what we're doing today, and making sure that we continue this conversation. If you are cis straight, make sure that if you hear somebody making transphobic comments, that you call them out on it, and hold them accountable. And that's how that starts.
So we literally have 1 minute left, so I'm gonna cede 20 seconds to each of you guys. Do you wanna jump in, Craig?
Real quick, I would say there's too much of a place of privilege that we give to religious entities to hate on us. And a lot of cis, a lot of heterosexual people are in those spaces, and that's got to be challenged.
Professor Franke, last word.
Every civil rights movement has experienced a backlash right after it has had successes, whether it was the end of the Civil War and Jim Crow, or it was the dogs and fire hoses in the 1960s after Brown versus Board and the civil rights movement of that period, or after Roe versus Wade and some of the advances of the women's rights movement.
You've taken us right to the edge of the broadcast, so I'm going to thank you and everyone else for being here. The conversation will absolutely continue. Please keep the dialogue going. #BeHeard.